Good afternoon, everyone. I am Summer Lee, and I am a state representative from Allegheny County, representing the Mon Valley communities, some of the eastern suburbs and eastern portion of the city of Pittsburgh, which means that I represent at any given time the part of the country, right, where we have on any given day amongst the worst air quality in the nation. And the reality is that as someone who has grown up in the Mon Valley, as someone who lived in the shadow of industry, in the shadow of a steel mill, air pollution and environmental justice has always been just an undercurrent in my life, even as it's not been something that I had expertise in, right? It's not been something that so many of us in our community maybe realized that we had or didn't have the language to address, the language to speak about, but it's something that through our lived experiences, we just know inherently about. So when I first started running, I realized very quickly that I was an environmental advocate. And it wasn't a title that I had considered that I had myself. And it may be the journey to coming there wasn't the same as so many other environmental experts and environmental advocates, but it was an important one because I came through environmental advocacy through lived experience. What we know is that if you are Black or brown or poor, you are more likely to live in a place in this country where there is poor air quality or poor water, or some sort of environmental threat or hazard in your community. It is all over this nation. It's not just the Mon Valley. It's not just Flint. There are places all over this country where marginalized folks live, and that is no accident. When we consider the choices that folks make who represent us, when we consider the cyclical issues that we face, we know that for so long in this country, communities like mine, communities like so many that you advocate for, that you live in, that you represent, those communities have rarely had a voice, have rarely been centered, even in advocacy that directly impacts them. I came to this work because when I was running, we had a startling statistic that approximately 35% of the kids in the school district that I went to, the school district that I represent, has asthma. That is well above the national average. We know that in our communities, people are more likely to have COPD, or respiratory illness, or cancer. And we know that every time we try to talk about our health, every time we mount and organize around our air quality, we get pushback from people who don't believe or don't want us to fight to hold industry, to hold polluters accountable. But we know that it's not just economic justice or environmental justice. It's both of those things at the exact same time. That's why it's so important that as we are organizing, that as we are creating dialogue about environmental racism, that we are intentional and explicit, that not only are we clear about our words and about what we're fighting for, about what we're up against, about who is impacted, how they are impacted. We're clear about who is impacting them. We are clear about how not only can we move our elected officials, but that if we want to actually create change, we know that it's not going to come from the people who have been there for as long as they have already been there. What we learned in Western Pennsylvania, what we learned in my community, is that if we want to impact policy change, that sometimes the only way that we can do that is if we organize ourselves, right? If we are mounting campaigns on the outside to do the job that too many or too few of our elected officials are willing to do. And I know this because I serve in a body that is not just hesitant to do something about our environmental crisis in one of the largest oil and gas producing states. It outright refuses to listen to our communities, to consider our communities. And the only way we are going to change that is when we organize ourselves, starting with the most impacted. So I wanted to share that in my district, when I first started to run 3 years ago, we ran district-wide, and we didn't know that we would do it, but it was very intuitive. We ran district-wide on keeping a fracking proposal out of our backyard. It was going to go on top of our already heavy pollution source, which means that those poor and Black community members overwhelmingly would now be inundated with not just one environmental hazard, but another on top of that. But we mounted our own defense. We used the campaign when I ran for state rep as an organizing instrument, where not only did we run on getting someone elected who was pro-environment, who has lived experiences, who centered environmental racism, not just environmental justice, but used every resource that we had to bring in more people in our community to make this their fight. And we spent 3 years flipping councils, electing state legislators, organizing community members who had lived in this area their entire lives and knew firsthand what it is like to live in a community where they cannot breathe. And because we did that work, because we were able to elect people at the local level, because we were able to elect people who will use their voice and their resource to hold industry accountable, their electeds accountable in both parties, we were able to stop that fracking well. And that might seem small, but what we know is that this community could not take one more polluting source. The people of this community have already suffered. This community has already seen economic distress because of industry leaving us, right? And that's how we have to talk about this. We have to help people understand that the way we are going to affect policy change is by moving people. We have to join our labor movement with our environmental movement, with our community movement, with our community organizing, because the pathway forward, the pathway to a just transition, which is not just a word, right, but is an action, but is a plan, a strategic plan that we must create together. The way that we are going to get to a Green New Deal is going to come straight from Western Pennsylvania. It's going to come straight from a district like mine, where as we empower new voters, as we empower new activists and environmental advocates, we have seen tangible results in our area. Now, that might not seem like a lot, but we have shown that when we actually bring people, that when we actually get behind them, when we actually put our resources together, we can start to fight back against industry and elected officials who we had never thought we'd have the power to go up against. So for me, what I want to see for our air quality, what I want to see for policy, I want to see action, just like everyone else. I want to encourage, and I spend all of my energy in encouraging and compelling my colleagues, Democrats and Republicans, to understand that we cannot wait, that there is no option, right? That this is inevitable, and that we can pretend to be friends of labor, right? We can pretend that we are just centering economic justice, but the days are waning where we can bury our heads in the sand and pretend that our environmental crisis will go away if our elected officials just ignore it. We have to have bold leadership from the front. We have to get rid of those folks who would say that you have the false choice, which I say is a lazy choice, that you can only have labor or environment, right? We know that that is no longer a limitation that we are going to accept in our communities. That's how we'll change policy. And that might seem hard. That might not seem like the answer that folks are expecting, that the real environmental change, that the environmental movement from the outside is going to be what saves us. But it is the truth. It is the truth. So I encourage folks that even as we have a state legislature that has abdicated its duty, abdicated its responsibility to move on air quality issues, to move on environmental justice issues, that as they have shown us who they are, they have shown us where their interests lie, that we now have a duty that we must not abdicate. To organize, to mobilize, to politicize our next generations that are coming up, that are already environmental stewards, that we have a responsibility to not just bring those new young folks into this movement, but to protect them so that they're never jaded, so that they don't burn out in this fight because we need them so much, that we show them where their power lies, that we show them how much influence they have. We will affect policy when we go into the labor community and we help them realize how they deserve a safe working condition and how they also deserve clean air and clean water in the communities that they work in. We're going to win as we start to flip seats in Democrat and Republican areas, even where we have Democrats who say that we believe in climate change. If they are not voting with their money, if they're not voting with their policy, then they are not doing what we need them to do. And we have a mandate. We have a mandate to replace them. We have a mandate to support those environmental activists and candidates from the beginning, in primaries and generals, in and out of election cycles. That's how we change policy in the state. That's how we're going to change policy, have already changed policy in our local communities. That's how we are going to empower people to make the decisions for themselves as their environmental stewardship pertains. And that's how we're going to win a Green New Deal. That's how we're going to win sustainable energy policy. And I am honored to be a part of that fight. I am honored to continue to go in and day out, both inside the system and outside the system, to organize around that, because I know that we will win. I know that we have no other options, but we can't back down, and we can't turn away. We can't miss a single opportunity, whether they're election cycles or interest campaigns. All of those are chances for us to change and correct course on our air quality in this region and in this nation. Thank you. I spent my first election cycle in Western Pennsylvania, right, in Allegheny County, where we are a majority Democratic area. This is a blue area by all means. And the work that we had to do to convince environmental donors and the environmental community to get in the race, right, as we're running against someone who voted for fracking proposals, right, voted against environmental protections. And it was like a clear contrast. And it was, for whatever reason, just not intuitive. The environmental community has, one of the biggest issues that we face, right, is this: we've been beat down by folks who outgun us. And sometimes when people outgun us, we feel like maybe it's not even worth getting into the fight, or we pick the wrong fights. So I've been spending my time for the last 3 years convincing them how important it is to actually just invest in these local and state races. And when we do that, we can actually change that, right? Because we invested in just flipping a council, right? We just flipped a borough council and we stopped the fracking proposal because of that. Like, and if we had not done that, they would be fracking on Edgar Thompson right now, which is 7 miles from the city of Pittsburgh. It is in a densely populated community, right? That was a community-led effort that, with just a little help, just a little bit of money and resources for the environmental community, we've been able to change the narrative, right? If the environmental community had not backed me, right, we would only have one national level politician from this area saying every day that we can't end fracking, or that we can't have a sustainable energy because you won't win on it in this region, right? You won't win it in our community, right? By just having someone else's voice balancing that out and opposing that and proving that they can continue to win, right? It's showing us the way, the pathway forward to actually winning on these policies. They're not, they're not frightening policies, but the disinformation campaign is large, right? So we have to go toe to toe with it, and we got to put our money where our mouth is sometimes too. As long as they are convinced that, as long as it's not in my neighborhood, that it's okay, that in and of itself is the barrier, right? These communities that are marginalized would be able to say no if our more affluent communities said no louder, right? No, not there either. No, you can't go there. No, you can't continue to victimize those folks. No, you can't continue to ignore those communities, right? That's what real solidarity is. That's the only way that we're going to be able to really insulate those other communities that have to take that industry on, right? So that they don't have to, so that they can actually we can actually start preparing for more sustainable energies, right? But as long as we can't say no to oil and gas, right? And like, as long as we can't say no to them, that means that we're all in danger.